Good morning. This morning we're going to talk about what in this part of the world is the most common community-acquired pneumonia, namely San Joaquin Valley fever, commonly known as that, scientifically known as coccidioidomycosis. It was first described in this individual. This is not my high school graduation picture, although it's been interpreted as such. This was an Argentinian soldier who was brought in from the Pampas in Argentina with this strange malady. You can see his skin is severely involved, and he died shortly thereafter. And the case was described in 1896 in Argentina by an Argentinian medical student by the name of Posada and his German pathology teacher, Wernicke. 1896 was only 4 years after Robert Koch described the tubercle bacillus and really opened up the modern era of germ-based theories of infectious diseases. So you can see that this disease is as old almost in its scientific study as is tuberculosis, which is an ancient disease. 4 years later, this man was seen in San Francisco, a Portuguese fisherman who was fishing the San Francisco Bay and would take his catch and sell it in the city of Tracy that I'm sure many of you have been through. And he too had these lesions on his skin, was severely ill, and died. And this was the first American case of what was later became known as San Joaquin Valley fever. So the name of the disease carries with it many names. Posada, who first described it, later San Joaquin Valley fever, when it was found that this disease seemed to exist in the San Joaquin Valley fever. Then in 1917, when the first detailed scientific study was published by a pathologist from Stanford by the name of Opholz, he gave it the names coccidioidomycosis. He also gave the organism, the germ, the bug, the name Coccidioides immitis. He identified it properly as a fungus, a member of the mushroom family, not a bacterium, not a virus, not a parasite, but a fungus, a mold. And then later on, the names were shortened, and the common name now that most people use is cocci. And those of you who've noticed my car in the parking lot may have noticed that that is my license plate right there. It was quickly decided that by Opholz and others that there was a biphasic life cycle to this organism, two distinct modes of existence. One, the saprophytic cycle, which is the soil cycle. Like any other mushroom, it lives in the soil, and ultimately it produces arthrospores, which are wafted about in the wind and liberated from the soil by the wind or some other soil-disturbing activity, which are then inhaled by susceptible animals and humans, which at 37 degrees set up a parasitic cycle. And then the organism becomes a true parasite of humans or animals, and ultimately develops a mature sporangium called the spherule, which is a small sphere filled with little daughter cells, which then mature and rupture and repeat the cycle. This is about a 24-hour cycle, It is very aggressive, and you can see from the number of organisms created, each of these becomes one of those, that this is a very aggressive disease. Here you see these spherule. This is a stain that is very useful for identifying them. It is the PAP stain, the papinicular stain, that is used for early cancer diagnosis. It's readily available in any laboratory anywhere in the world, and it very quickly brings out the spherule. As you can see, here is the spherule, the sphere, with the little daughter cells seen within it. Here you see the rupturing of one of the spherules and the huge number of cells that are liberated in the process. Here you see the same thing in tissue. Again, the spherule with the daughter cells called endospheres within it, surrounded by this pus. And here you see it in culture. Typical mushroom mold culture. Same thing you see on your bread if you leave it out too long. It is here shown in a petri dish. This is only for emphasis. It should never be grown in a petri dish, because if I had this petri dish sitting right here in front of me, if I opened it and closed it, half of you in this room would become infected. So this is a very tricky material that has to be handled very carefully in special apparatus and in special laboratories. Distribution of cocci all over the world is quite interesting and important. It has been found only in the New World, only in the Western Hemisphere, and within the Western Hemisphere, only in certain areas. The southwestern United States and the contiguous areas of Mexico, patches in South America, in Argentina, in Paraguay, and most recently, a small area in Brazil. Now, this does not mean that it is not in other areas. These are areas that are not very densely populated, and unless you are in an area where there are a lot of people living, and people get sick, and somebody makes the correct diagnosis, it will not become known. And it's entirely possible that there are many other areas in both South America, probably not so much in North America, because it is much more populated and it has been studied much more carefully. And then there are small patches also in Central America. In the United States, it is found most commonly in the southern San Joaquin Valley, in southern Arizona, particularly around Phoenix and Tucson, and in patches of New Mexico and Texas, particularly in the Texas Panhandle around El Paso. These numbers mean that 50% of the population, like here in Kern County or in southern Arizona, will have been infected, as evidenced by a skin test survey that used to be done very commonly in those areas, but has not been done much lately because the material has not been available. But in the last one we did here in Bakersfield, where we tested people literally off the street, we found that 56% of adults reacted positive, meaning that over half of the population of this area has had valley fever. Now, many of those did not know that they had had it. In over half the cases, the disease is so mild that patients don't consider themselves sick enough to seek medical aid and have a diagnosis established. They have a mild disease, they get well, and they remain immune for the rest of their lives. The area of what we call endemicity, of involvement, in other words, is coincides very closely with a old biological concept called biological life zones. This is a map that was drawn up in the 1890s of the what is called the Lower Sonoran Life Zone in California, in the black areas of the Lower Sonoran Life Zone, which is a combination of climatic conditions, soil conditions, flora and fauna in that area. And this map has allowed us to predict the type of areas where valley fever would be found. Now here you see typical valley fever type of country. This is the view from my living room here in Bakersfield. It is a semi-arid, semi-desert country characterized, among other things, by the creosote bush. We have learned over the years that whenever you find creosote bushes growing, you're probably in areas where the valley fever spores live. And when you do soil isolations in the areas around the creosote bush, you frequently are able to actually grow the organism from the soil. Now that does not mean that creosote bushes or creosote causes valley fever. It simply means that the creosote bush grows and likes to grow in the same area where the valley fever organisms are alive. As I mentioned, the lung is the portal of entry. And in the lung, the spores, a single spore can cause a number of lesions. The most common is a small patch of pneumonia. Next is a pleural effusion, fluid in the pleural space between the lung and the chest wall. The hilar lymph nodes will usually enlarge on the side of the pneumonia, and occasionally a brief period of cavitation is noted, and in very severe cases, a generalized spread throughout the lung fields is seen, called a miliary disease. These will clear up, usually by themselves in most cases, and will leave behind, in about 10% of cases, a certain number of lesions, including persistent pneumonia, particularly in diabetics, a small coin lesion, which represents a scar, actually a filled-in cavity. Occasionally, chronic cavities, holes in the lungs are seen. Sometimes the lymph node will persist for some time there. Now, what are the symptoms? The symptoms of valley fever pneumonia are those of any other lower respiratory tract infection. Cough, 89% of cases. This is a series of 1,000 cases that we analyzed in detail here a few years ago that I'll be talking about more later. 82% fever, 70% headache. Now that is a little bit different from ordinary standard community acquired pneumonia, that 3/4 of the patients will have a significant headache for some time. Chest pain is also somewhat unique, 70% of the patients. Most bacterial and viral pneumonias will cause chest discomfort, but will not really cause chest pain, which valley fever does. Chills, and then 2/3 of the patients will have certain skin lesions that I'll show you in a minute. And the rest are just symptoms you would expect, shortness of breath, general feeling of sickness, muscle pain, night sweats, phlegm, sputum production, some stiff neck occasionally with a headache, and some weight loss. This is the characteristic skin lesion called erythema nodosum. Big, painful, red bumps. Has anybody in this room ever had them or seen them on someone? They used to be more common than they are now. They're usually seen in young women. They're almost always between the knee and the ankle, just as you see here. And they go away by themselves quite rapidly. The X-ray will, as you would expect, show extensive pneumonia. Here you see a large area of pneumonia in the right lower lobe with pneumonia also on the left. And this was an elderly woman with very expensive pneumonia. She required respiratory assistance on a ventilator, and she actually ultimately died from this pneumonia. Another more localized area of pneumonia right here, and characteristically, a valley fever likes to sit on what are called the fissures, the divisions between the lobes, in this case on the left between the left upper and left lower lobes. Another patchy area, again, sitting on the fissure. Here you see the enlarged lymph nodes that I mentioned, quite characteristic, quite large. Here you see, I'm sorry, this is pictures reversed, large area of pneumonia sitting in the upper part of the, the right upper lobe, resembling tuberculosis somewhat. Here is a valley fever that when I first saw it, and everybody else who saw it, called tuberculosis. Is a typical TB picture, extensive involvement of both upper lobes with multiple cavities, but this too turned out to be valley fever, not tuberculosis. Here you see the fluid I mentioned between the chest wall and the pleural space. This is a young man who had this extensive disease for about 10 years before he died of respiratory insufficiency. He was employed as a miner of kitty litter in the west side of the valley here near Taft. And in surveying those workers there, we found several other cases who had coexisting pneumoconiosis, dust-borne disease, and San Joaquin Valley fever. He too died, as I mentioned. Extensive pneumonia again in the right lower lobe. Cavity, sorry, this picture is also reversed. Cavity, you see the hole, see some fluid, and you see some air already leaking into the space, bringing about a collapse of the lung. And usually this type of disease requires surgical intervention, either with a chest tube or with the removal of the cavity if the leakage continues. And here you see a picture of such a cavity, thick wall, even though on the X-ray it usually appears as a thin-walled cavity. Actually, the wall is quite thick, and the extensive area of lung destruction within it. You see it very clearly on the CT scan, right here. And you can see how peripheral it is and how easy it is for air in this cavity to leak out in the pleural space and bring about the collapse of that lung. Well, when you suspect valley fever based on the history that the patient gives and the type of x-rays I just showed you, there are certain tests that can be given, fortunately, that allow us, in most cases, rapidly to make the correct diagnosis. I mentioned the skin test already. The skin test has not been available for the last 20 years due to some manufacturing problems. The skin test only will tell you when it becomes available again, as it will shortly, I think, that the person has had valley fever at some time in their life. It does not tell you whether that sometime is now or sometime in the past. So we move on with a set of blood tests established by a group that was active during the war here in Kern County, when a lot of airmen were being trained for flight training in the Army Air Forces, and valley fever was their #1 health problem. There was more time lost in flight training from valley fever here at Midderfield and Gardner Field and some other areas that are still active, Lemur base. More time lost from valley fever than all other causes put together. All other illnesses, all other accidents put together. Every time a valley fever case brought about a dropout in the 90-day training routine, that place was lost. So it was a major military problem, and the Army spent a large amount of money recruiting people to study the disease and come up with certain aids to control it. And much of the scientific work that I'll be talking about now, in diagnosis particularly, was established by that group during the war here. The blood tests include the standard 2 precipitin, the complement fixation test. There are some short tests that are now available, so-called screening tests, testing for IgA and IgM and IgG. IgM is the precipitin. IgG is the material in the complement fixation test. These screening tests, while they're being used frequently and commonly by standard laboratories, still have some major problems, particularly the high rate of false positives. And whenever you really suspect the disease, you should do the complete panel, which is available in the health department here at Kern County, also available in research laboratories such as the University of California at Davis, in San Diego, the Nichols Laboratory in Orange County, and some other places. But the best work for local use is here at the Kern County Health Department, which has been doing this for many years and does it very rapidly and reliably. You can look at the sputum and do a wet mount. As I mentioned, you can also do the papinicular, the pap smear, and those, of course, of meaning only if they are positive. A negative test does in no way rule it out. The same goes for pus and other body fluids. You can do biopsies, examine tissue, and stain it properly for fungi. And you can culture sputum, pus, or body fluids, as I showed you earlier, being sure to use the proper equipment. These are the tests that the Kern County Health Department will do. In addition to the skin test not presently available, they will do an IgM test. The IgM test, they will do both the latex agglutination and the ELISA test. They will also do a 2 precipitin test, all of these tests for IgM. The immunodiffusion test has recently been added to the repertoire, and that too tests for IgM. IgM comes up early, but disappears, as I'll show you in a moment. The IgG test, done with the immunodiffusion test, and also this ELISA screening test, as I mentioned, will stay longer, will stay positive longer, will also have a quantitative base which allows you to follow the progress of the patient's disease. It comes up a little later, but as I say, it stays positive much longer. And this is the panel that will be done if you send your samples to the County Health Department here or to UC Davis. The IgM, as I said, comes up early, but does not stay very long. The IgG comes up slower, but stays positive for a long period of time, for many months, until the illness has subsided completely, and is therefore the test we rely on mostly, particularly for following our patients after we have established the diagnosis with the IgM test. The natural history of this disease is rather clearly defined. As I mentioned earlier, 60% of the patients have no symptoms. Think they have a little cold, don't bother to see a doctor, get well, and can be identified only as having had valley fever if they have one of those lesions in the chest or if they have a positive skin test. The 40% that are sick enough to see a doctor have the usual symptoms that we reviewed of a flu-like disease of a lower respiratory tract infection. And they too will most of the time make an uneventful recovery. However, 5 or 10% of them will have some residual lesion in the lung. A small percentage, somewhere between 1 and 2%, goes on to severe disease, either severe pulmonary disease or what we call disseminated disease, where the disease stops not at the lung but spreads throughout the body to other parts of the body, particularly to the skin, to the bones, to the joints, and most frequently and most seriously to the meninges, the membranes that cover the brain at the base of the brain. And most of our severe illness and most of our deaths come from this group. Most of our knowledge has been gained through 3 major epidemics of valley fever. The World War II epidemic, which I mentioned, the dust storm of 1977. How many of you remember that dust storm of 1977? We have a number of hands up. As you may remember, there was a total dust cloud that blacked out literally the city of Bakersfield for 24 hours or more, wiped out Arvin totally. Some people did not consider that much of a loss. And then finally, this dust cloud moved on to, here you see it. This is a picture taken by photographer pilot by Bill Chase, who happened to be flying into Bakersfield from the east that day. And where Bakersfield should be, this is all he saw. And this was a famous picture. It's been on the cover of National Geographic, among other things. And this was what this looked like over Bakersfield the day of the dust storm. The dust storm then moved north in the valley and hit a inversion area over Sacramento and Marysville, deposited all this topsoil from the lower San Joaquin Valley over Sacramento, and caused over 300 cases of valley fever in Sacramento, an area in which the disease had never been seen before and fortunately has not been seen since. However, there were 8 deaths among those 300 cases. So this was a very major health problem, as you can imagine. And then the most recent epidemic that was on the previous slide was a marked increase of cases that we first saw in the early 90s here and also in Arizona, which has continued right up to the present time. The usual incidence here in 1990 and all the years before was about 250 cases a year. Now these are diagnosed cases. As I mentioned, there are many other cases that are so mild that they're not diagnosed, or so sick but the diagnosis for one reason or another is not established. So even then, there were many more than 250 diagnosed cases, probably 6 to 10 times as many. It's been estimated in those days that there were probably around 100 to 150,000 cases each and every year in the endemic areas. And then here in 1901, something began to happen. Marked increase in cases. Now these are Kern County figures. In 92, you had this huge increase, which persisted into 93, then abated, and briefly in 97 went back to where it had been, but then started increasing again in 2001 and has been increasing ever since. And the last 3 years, we have seen over 1,000 cases, 1,000 diagnosed cases here in Kern County alone. And the increase is continuing. meetings and discussions have been held to try to account for this. Is it the change in the climate, which really has not occurred? Is it the increase in population, which certainly has occurred? Is it the increase in construction that certainly has occurred? But none of those factors by themselves and added together account for the change. So we are still puzzled and are still studying the ecology of the area, trying to determine why this change has occurred. Each and every year, the highest incidence used to be in the late summer and early fall. However, again, in the last few years, we have seen this increase throughout the winter time also. So there's definitely a change. And again, these are the Kern County figures. These are the Arizona figures, and these are for control the Nevada and Texas figures, where there's only been a very slight increase. Particularly following the dust storm, we saw valley fever, as I mentioned, areas where it had not been seen before. However, it was also seen increasing in areas somewhat removed from the San Joaquin Valley, such as Salinas Valley, Livermore, Tracy, which I've mentioned before. And then a very heavy incidence area in the last 10 years has been Coalinga. Coalinga has had a lot of major construction. It's at the west side of the valley in Fresno County. They've built a very large prison there. They've built a home for defective children there. And there's been a tremendous number of valley fever cases in the people brought there to those two institutions. The thing that has intrigued us more than anything else in trying to figure out why these changes has been the connection with the rainfall. And it has been thought that following a heavy, wet year, that there was an increase of valley fever. And occasionally that was the case. If you will look at the heavy rainfall of 78, this preceded the dust storm. If you will look at the heavier than average rainfall in 91, only slightly. 4 is our average here, 4 inches, and there was really not much. There was an increase in cases. However, the next year, when there were almost the same number, the same amount of rain, there were only half the cases. So it is more than just rainfall. Obviously, the dust storm is a reason, and we saw that particularly confirmed. Well, here's the rainfall figures again. The heaviest rainfall here in 91 did not bring about a significant increase as did the smaller rainfall of 92, which brought about many more cases. So rainfall may be part of it, but it's not all of it. The earthquakes, the 52 earthquake did not cause a significant increase in valley fever cases. The Northridge earthquake in 93 in Los Angeles did, and many cases of valley fever were seen in areas where it had not been seen before, particularly the western part of the San Fernando Valley, Chatsworth, and on into Camarillo. Many, many cases there. Well, I mentioned that the most serious form of the disease is the dissemination, when it spreads to other parts of the body. There are certain risk factors for this, which have been identified. The extremes of age, both the very young and the very old are much more susceptible because of a decreased efficiency of the immune system at the two extremes of life. Certain racial groups have been identified as having some genetic predilection for dissemination. In the 40s, it was the Filipinos in this area that were by far more susceptible than any other group. More recently, it has been Afro-American males that have shown great susceptibility to dissemination. Also, Native Americans, Hispanics of Indian extraction have shown a greater susceptibility to dissemination. Dissemination is slightly more common in males. Certain chest X-ray findings, like the miliary disease that I showed you earlier, is a predictor for dissemination. Very high serum CF titers, high levels of IgG, or particularly a rapid increase in the titer of IgG is a predictor for dissemination, the rate of change. Pregnancy is a contributing factor because of the immunosuppression that occurs naturally during pregnancy on the part of the host, the mother, not to consider the fetus a foreign body that needs to be expelled. These are all factors. Here's an example of the earthquake. This was after the Northridge earthquake, one of the aftershocks taken in the Santa Susana Pass between Fillmore and Moore Park, and you see the dust being shaken loose by the aftershock. And of course, with the dust, anything that is living in the soil on the surface, such as valley fever spores, gets shaken loose. And there were, as I said, many, many cases at that time. Dissemination most commonly used to be in the skin. Now, most commonly, is in the meninges. In the skin, you see a lesion like this on the wing of the nose, quite characteristic of valley fever. On the scalp, this gentleman was a so-called snowbird. He lived in Ohio, but he came out to Arizona every winter. And you see this lesion here that really looks like a severe case of psoriasis almost. This young man was an athlete who used to come and train for track, and he developed this lesion. All of these were biopsy-proven valley fever lesions. This lady lived in Watts in Los Angeles, but came up here frequently in the canals to go fishing. And one day she cut her toe and developed this type of a lesion in the toe and later on the back, and she ultimately died of meningitis. This is not the erythema nodosum that I showed you earlier. This is an infection in the shin bone, osteomyelitis caused by valley fever. Here are enlarged lymph nodes, commonly seen in valley fever when it disseminates. And you also see a skin lesion here on this gentleman. A skull lesion. This was a young Afro-American girl, the daughter of a sergeant out at Everett Air Base. And you see these lesions in the bone of her skull here. The spine is a common site, and it can be very destructive, as you see here. This lesion seen on the ophthalmoscope, very uncommon lesion. The patient that you see here was an ophthalmologist who actually diagnosed this lesion on himself and took the picture himself. And here you see at the base of the brain this apron-like lesion. I'm sorry, I'm out of juice. Oh, no, I'm not. Which obstructs the flow of spinal fluid at the aqueduct and causes an enlargement of the ventricles and a plastering of the brain against the skull, and ultimately, unless this is treated and relieved surgically, death from hydrocephalus. The rate of dissemination, as I mentioned, vary among different groups. It is somewhat increased among Hispanics, significantly increased among Asians, and highest among Afro-American males. So, what do we do about all of this? The ideal drug against this or any other disease, for that matter, is a broad-spectrum antifungal activity, fungicidal, one that kills the fungus rather than just keeps it from growing, one that does not allow the development of resistance, one that can be given both orally and intravenously, one that penetrates body fluids everywhere readily, especially into the spinal fluid for meningitis, and of course that is non-toxic. Well, such a drug does not exist and shows no immediate prospects of being developed. Treatment started in 1954 when a group of us were the first ones to use a drug called amphotericin here in Bakersfield, and my colleague, Dr. Bill Wynn, was using it in Springville at the TB sanatorium. Prior to that time, all of these drugs that you see listed here, well over 50, had had major articles in medical journals claiming that they were effective antifungal agents in the treatment of valley fever. None of them have stood the test of time. None of them are used today. All of them proved to be worthless until amphotericin came along. And amphotericin, the first drug you see listed there, is a polyene. It is probably still the most effective single drug that we have. However, it has some major problems. One is that it has significant toxicity, particularly on the kidney. Two, that it is not well tolerated by people. And three, that it has to be given intravenously. So recently, some newer variations of the polyene amphotericin have been created, liposomal amphotericin or colloidal dispersion called amphosil, which overcome many of these barriers, and so we are have gone back to using amphotericin more than we did. We can use it longer, we can use it in larger doses because of these better preparations. In 1978, the first orally effective drug came along, followed in 81 by ketoconazole, which was used and is still occasionally being used now. And modifications of these drugs, a triazole using 3 of the azole rings, is the drug we most commonly use at the present time. Fluconazole, or commonly known as diflucan, is the most commonly used drug at the moment. It is very well tolerated, can be given orally. The main toxicity used to be that it was extremely expensive. However, recently it has gone generic, so the main toxicity, if you will, has been removed. And some newer drugs have recently come out, protoconazole being one of them, another one being a cell wall destroying drug called inacococydin. Another drug that we are trying experimentally is called voriconazole. So there is some activity for better drugs. The problem with all of these drugs is that, with the exception of amphotericin, they do not kill the organism. They simply keep it from multiplying. They are what we call fungistatic agents. Now, until we get a safe, effective, non-toxic, oral fungicidal agent, we cannot really feel that we have something that will treat this disease effectively. So, whom do we treat with the armamentarium we have? We treat all disseminated disease, all cases that have spread. We treat most lung diseases, most primary cases, particularly the rapidly progressive ones, the ones that have a high titer, the ones that show slow resolution, or where the host has certain risk factors. with the availability of fluconazole now, particularly at the lower price level, most of us now treat every single case of primary valley fever that we see, because we never know when we first see a case immediately who is going to be the bad one. And there is evidence that by doing that, that we can actually prevent the some cases of dissemination. The drugs act on the cell wall, as I say. They prevent the completion of the cell wall, which requires ergosterol. They block the conversion of lanosterol into ergosterol, and thus the cell wall will start leaking cellular contents, and the organism will not multiply. However, it will, as I say, definitely still cause ultimate spreading of the disease and continuation of the illness. These are the neuroamphotericins I talked about, and you will see here the kidney damage. The upper orange curve is the loss of kidney function from amphotericin over time of administration. The lower one is the newer drug, which causes very little and therefore is the preferred agent. However, it too has to be given intravenously, and it remains extremely expensive. This is a special study we did in a group of patients during the epidemic who were given fluconazole early on, and you can see that the ones who got the early treatment, which are the pink columns, had a much lower incidence of length of illness and complications. And it is this data which has really caused us to treat every case early with a 68% reduction of late serious complications. The epidemic, when it first started in '91, has been carefully studied, and we went back and looked at all the cases of that year that we could find. We found that 76%, 3/4, had recovered completely, 3.2% had died, 3.4% were still on treatment a year later, and 17% we could not find. The economic burden of that same year to the county of Kern was tremendous, with a total cost of the illness in terms of expenses of the illness and lost income and production was $66.6 million in 1991. So you can see this was a very, very major problem. Many things have been tried to control this disease. Soil treatments have been ineffective. Soil fungicides that are used extensively in agriculture have been ineffective. We are gradually paving over all of Southern California with roads, shopping centers, golf courses, houses. So someday when this area will all be paved over, there will probably be no valley fever, but who would want to live in it? So the emphasis in recent years has been on developing a vaccine to immunize people against the disease, in addition to finding better drugs, perhaps drug combinations. But item 3, the vaccine. We developed a vaccine from the crude cultures, which was tested extensively here in 1978. It got a lot of publicity. This was a picture in People magazine of one of our workers on the vaccine project. You see Shark's Tooth Hill in the back there, which has always been a high incidence area for valley fever, and the attempt to immunize people. That vaccine was shown to be capable of immunization, but was very poorly tolerated and had to be abandoned. We are currently working to try to develop another vaccine using initially recombinant material, which lately we've had to make a change there. This program is very much going. You may have heard about it or read about it in the paper. We are 7 years and $14 million down the road, with probably another 4 or 5 years and $5 million to go to bring it to completion. This is a unique program. It is the first time since the Salk polio vaccine that a major immunization trial has been launched by a community on a voluntary basis with voluntary financial contributions from citizens, from service clubs, from industry, and only to a lesser extent from government. So you will all, I hope, be hearing some good news about this activity, and I'm sure many of you will become involved when we get to the point of having a public trial of the usefulness of the vaccine in the so-called efficacy trial in helping us launch that, which will be a very major undertaking some years down the road. So this is the Valley Fever story. As people working in the healthcare field, and particularly in the pulmonary respiratory division, this will be one of your major challenges: patients with valley fever, answering their questions, taking care of their needs, and contributing what you can as healthcare professionals to the ultimate solution and conquest of this health problem, which is feasible and which is beginning to show some light at the end of a 120-year-old tunnel. Thank you for your attention.